Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Vintage of the Week. I'm Brandon Frazen, Director of Vintage here at Bob's Watches, and I'm here with Emily, my colleague, and we're going to be answering some frequently asked vintage questions submitted by you, our audience. But before we get into it, let's see, what are you wearing today, Emily?
Do a wrist check, eh?
Yeah,
All right,
right.
so I've got a date just on from the early 80s. You can see it has this bark bezel motif.
Woof. Yeah.
Yeah, woof woof. Pretty big fan of it. Anyway, what do you got on?
I have a double red sea dweller, one of my favorites. It has a really nice faded bezel and really nice patina.
That looks amazing.
Yeah, gotta go big or go home today.
As always, we definitely are curious what you guys are wearing too, so be sure to let us know. It's one of my favorite parts of your Vintage of the Week episodes.
Thank you.
Your audience has been really good about checking in on what they're wearing. So
They have. That's been nice.
I know. So like you mentioned, we're actually going to answer some questions that the audience has submitted, you know, really focused around vintage watches, which I'm sure you get a lot of these questions
Yeah.
day to day. So anyway, thank you guys so much for your submissions. Are you ready to kick this off?
Yeah, let's get into
All
it.
right. So our first question, how often should you service your vintage watch?
It's a good question. I always recommend servicing a vintage watch when it shows signs that it needs to be serviced. Like it's not keeping time, maybe there's moisture under the crystal, or something else is obviously wrong. The thing is, when you service a watch, you have to open it up and take it apart. And every time you open up a vintage watch or any watch, you risk something happening. So with vintage, some of these pieces are hard to replace or irreplaceable. So
Yeah.
I say the least times they're opened up, the better.
Yeah, I think you have a really good rule of thumb too, is always checking to make sure that the crown is screwed down.
Yep, that's a big.
Then you avoid any accidents, unwanted for the most part, right?
Good call, Emily. Yeah, I always keep the crown closed and always check it.
Yep.
It shouldn't unscrew, but you know.
You've
it's
taught
always
me that one for sure, so that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, so as always, we field a lot of questions from our social. So this one came from Instagram. They asked, what years are actually considered vintage?
Another good question that we hear all the time.
Do you?
Yeah. A lot of people say over 20 years, and I've said that before. But now, 20 years ago is 2002, and watches from 2002 don't feel vintage. Some of them could be, I guess, but
Okay.
So it really comes down to the characteristics of the watch. So for instance, if it's a Rolex with an aluminum bezel, tritium lume from the 90s, I would say that could be classified as vintage.
Okay.
Some people only consider vintage Rolex if they have acrylic crystals, so that would go up until like the 80s.
Okay.
For me, I think if it has the aluminum bezel, tritium lume, drilled holes in the lugs,
Oh yeah.
those are all kind of characteristics of vintage
Okay.
watches. So that's one way to put it.
Okay, so this also comes from our Instagram audience. Someone's asking for your thoughts on wearing vintage watches as daily wearers. What do you think?
I'm all for it. So I do it. I know a lot of people who do it. And I think the big thing is you can wear vintage watches daily. You just have to be mindful of your environment. Maybe, you know, if you know you're going to be kind of like swimming or something, like don't wear a vintage watch. Or if you're going to be playing a sport, like the shock and on the movement is maybe not worth it. But, you know, if you can just be mindful when you're wearing it, I think that's the biggest thing.
So vintage watches really ask for you to be mindful. I think that's pretty important. Okay, so another question. What's the best vintage Rolex to buy?
That's a good question. That's
Loaded
a tough
question.
That's a tough question. Depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different answer. For me, I would say something in the sub family because that's my favorite, you know, Submariner's vintage ones. But if my clients were asking me or anyone's asking, I would just have to in turn ask them some questions.
Okay.
Like, what are you looking for? What's your style? Sporty or dressy? Are you looking to wear the watch or are you just looking to collect it?
Ooh, crucial.
Because that could be depending.
A big
what you're looking for.
differentiator, right?
Also kind of, you know, what's your style?
All right, let's do this. So I'm your client.
Okay, cool.
Hi, Brandon. Nice to meet you. I'm
Pleasure.
excited about
Yeah.
getting into vintage watches. So about me, I am definitely more dressy than sporty.
Okay.
Has to be gold, and I
Okay.
would say characteristic-wise, I really enjoy unique features.
Okay.
So it doesn't have to be extremely rare, but something that's more on the rare side.
Right, you don't want to run into someone else wearing it, really. I would go with a gold, maybe I would say either probably a date just, a date, or like a date. But
Okay.
I brought for you here.
You brought me a suggestion. Okay.
Exactly. So it's an all 14K gold date with a mosaic dial in champagne, which is pretty uncommon. So you've got kind of the rare factor here.
Okay.
You've got the kind of dressy factor because it's gold,
Yeah.
but it's also pretty wearable.
that looks very much like something I would wear.
Yeah,
Definitely
it's nice.
an Emily watch, for sure.
Yeah,
Okay, you listened. So really it just boils down to, intern asking questions.
Yeah.
When people really start that, search for their perfect vintage watch.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to our audience. So Henry Gelpern from Instagram wants to know, do you prefer a matte or gilt dial, and why?
That is a good question also. I always go back and forth with matte versus glossy or gilt. I really probably go matte dial overall.
Okay.
I just like that kind of like chalkboard look. There's something about the matte dial that really mesmerizes me.
That's funny. From my little experience, I've really enjoyed the glossy dials. So again, kind of one of those questions where there's no wrong answer, but with your experience in the vintage world, what's your favorite reference with a matte dial?
With a matte dial, I would.
If you had to choose one.
I mean, maybe the double red seed dweller probably.
Okay.
I'm a big seed dweller fan, and there's just something about it. I love it.
Okay. I've seen the 1016 with the glossy dial that I love a lot. I think the 1675 is probably one of the most common, at least like when I picture a matte or glossy dial. I think that's where I default to go. All right, you ready for another one?
Yep.
Rapid fire over here.
Sure.
What are the best 5-digit Rolexes to buy right now?
That's a good question. Since I am kind of a sports Rolex fan, I would probably go with a sports. Probably with a 16800 matte dial. I think those are really good value still. And even 16800 with the white gold surround. So it just depends what you're looking for, but those are also a good value.
Okay.
Then also the 16750 GMTs.
Ooh.
So they're similar to the 16800s, the transitional GMTs. Those are nice. Matte or glossy dial, those are good value, I think.
Okay.
A lot of the 80s models.
A little underrated.
A little bit. And something in the 90s I really am a big fan of is the 14060. No date
Okay.
sub. That kind of replaced the 5513. I like those a lot, and I still think those are kind of,
Those have grown on me so much over the last year. That's a great recommendation.
yeah, so those are good, and I still think they're a little under the radar.
Okay. What about 16550?
Oh, right.
In or out?
Yeah, I'm a fan. Those
Okay.
are great. The cream dial is kind of a fan favorite. It's a beautiful watch, but also the black dials. We just were talking about one with the spider dial that was pretty cool, so that's been sticking out in my mind too.
Okay, those are all really helpful, especially just kind of being able to gauge sort of, what's undervalued in comparison to, kind of your prominent vintage watches. It's always fun to get an expert's opinion, so thank you for sharing those details. Okay, so we've got another one from our Instagram
All right,
family.
shoot.
What are the best vintage Rolexes under $5,000? They're asking for 3 examples.
Okay.
What do you got?
So a lot of the vintage ladies models.
Okay.
Those are definitely good deals under 5,000. You can get some good value there.
I love hearing that.
Some Air Kings for sure. Some Oyster Perpetuals.
Okay.
Of course, there's a lot of different reference numbers, so I'm just going to say kind of the model names.
Is that one you brought here?
Yeah, we have this Oyster Perpetual dates. This one's a reference 1500 with a pretty cool dial with the long minutes hash marks. Under 5,000, really good.
Beautiful watch.
Good value. Yeah, so there's still kind of a lot out there.
You did that pretty easily.
Yeah, and there's more. Even the Zephyr, this Oyster Perpetual Zephyr, and there's other models like this one. So, you just have to look, but they're out there.
Okay. Do you see a commonality between the size of the cases and the pricing? So these are relatively all 34 millimeter.
Yeah, there's a lot of 34 millimeters.
Okay.
And then for the ladies, those are going to be smaller.
Of course.
You could even probably find some Datejusts out there under that 5K mark. It's getting a little tougher. They are going up in value and getting more expensive.
Hey, those are 3 wonderful options. I would take all of them right now. So,
Yeah, I'm a big
okay.
fan.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Okay. Ooh, I love this question. Again, from our Instagram family. What is the best vintage seller?
Best vintage seller. So we get so many requests for GMTs and 5513s. It's amazing how many.
1675s?
Yes, excuse me. 1675s and 5513s, like these two. These are kind of just the ones that so many people are looking for. They're so iconic.
Truly.
I mean, I love them, and they're just great watches, and that's
Apparently,
why
so do buyers too.
a lot of people are looking for them, especially nice ones. So those are probably some of the most requested.
Yeah.
A lot of people also ask for Daytonas, of course. Just in general, I think the GMT and the subs are kind of the most for vintage.
Okay.
What we hear most.
That's awesome. All right. Well, thanks for hanging in there with me. We have
Sure.
one final question.
Yeah.
One of our Instagram followers has asked, what are the best vintage pieces between $5,000 and $10,000 that are not Rolex?
Oh, not Rolex? I don't know if I can answer this one. Just kidding.
I know you can.
Some of the best value in that 5 to 10K range, well, I guess, yeah, we can call them vintage, kind of going back to our other question. These vintage Tudors from the 90s, like this 79090 with the blue dial, blue bezel. I mean, these are really fantastic value, under 10, and they just look great. And these are cool because they're from the 90s, but they still use the folded link bracelet. They still have not matte dial, but they still have the non-white gold surrounds and this acrylic crystal. So you really kind of have a really good mix of vintage and modern features.
Yeah.
And they also have quick set dates, so that's kind of like a really nice combo. So these are great. They have the blue dials and the black dials. And then also, for another non-Rolex, Speedmasters.
Ooh.
Speedmaster Professional 145022.
Can never go wrong.
No, it's just such a classic. This one is from the 80s, but you know, one from the 80s, maybe the 70s, those are still good value. And you can't really go wrong, and they look just like earlier ones. They look like the original Professional. They look like the one from now. It's just a timeless watch. So those would be my two ones to like look into.
Okay, those are wonderful suggestions. That Tudor Submariner is beautiful, and honestly, I love a Speedmaster.
Yeah.
Especially from the vintage side. And, you know, they've done a really good job making even the modern ones still kind of a nod to the heritage of the model itself, but why not just go for a vintage?
Yeah, exactly. Especially these with the lume that will age, and the bezel could be a little aged. This one's pretty clean, but some others are kind of more aged.
Well, we are so lucky to have you on hand to be able to ask some of these vintage questions. I know we get them a lot, but it's nice coming from the source himself. You know, you've got plenty of years of experience and many more to come. So if you guys have any other questions, be sure to let us know in the comments. Brandon is happy to answer them.
Yeah, always. And I think that about wraps it up for this episode of Vintage of the Week. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining me, Emily. This is fun. I'm always happy to answer questions, and I always love, you know, hearing what our viewers want to know. So keep them coming, and see you next time. Take it easy.